Hi, welcome back to Creative Solutions for Low Self-Esteem. Be rich. Hire a hype man. Become taller. Just kidding. Today we're going to talk about the extradition of Dr. Hassan Diab in conversations that don't help with making friends or trivia. Okay, so first off, the first thing is that this case is going to be a little bit awkward to talk about just because it deals with an anti-Semitic attack. It deals with a bombing in Paris in 1980. So, and it's kind of difficult to talk about because that issue is so deeply political. So I'm just trying to be objective. I'm just here to pour the tea and tell about the case. So as awkward as that is, I'm going to go into it. So the reason that I wanted to do this case in particular was because I was actually a student of Dr. Diab's when he got arrested by the RCMP back in 2009, I believe. So, and I remember when they told us that he was gone, like I went to class, I was taking research methods, which is like sociology statistics. So taking research methods with him, and then when they told me that, he wasn't there anymore. So this other lady took over the class. She's very high up in the sociology department herself. She's a very good friend of Dr. Diab's. She took over the case and told us what happened about the whole case, how he was arrested, how she believed he was completely innocent. And I remember sitting there thinking, like, this guy, like, her, I don't see it for her, but okay. Like, it reminded me of that movie, Miss Congeniality, where they think that Cheryl Love Frazier, the April 25th girl, they thought that she was the terrorist or something, and they were like, Cheryl? So it was like, that's kind of how I felt when they said that my professor was a hardened terrorist. So, or alleged. The French government would allege that, or still alleges that he is. But because a Bachelor of Arts degree costs like $1 million, we only talked about it that one day and then we moved on. And then I followed the case over the next several years. So I'm going to go through the timeline of the case, and then I will talk about the evidence and the review of the case afterwards. And it makes more sense to go that way. So first of all, the incident in question was a bombing in Paris in 1980 at a synagogue. So I believe it was on a Saturday. It was in the evening, and it was on a Jewish holiday at the end of a service. So a blue Suzuki motorcycle was parked about 10 meters outside of the synagogue, and it had 10 kilograms of pentrate on the back of it. So pentrate is a chemical compound that is very similar to nitroglycerin. So it's very explosive. It doesn't really burn, so it's detonated with electricity, which makes it very easy to use in plastic explosives. So this bomb was blown up off the back of the motorcycle, and 4 people were killed in the explosion, and over 40 more people would end up injured. 2 or 3 of the people who died actually had nothing to do with the service that was going on inside. They just got caught in the blast. And if the blast had been detonated 10 minutes later, a lot of people would have died, because I think about 300 people were in the synagogue at that time because it was a very important Jewish holiday. So a few different groups took responsibility for the bombing right after it happened, but later on, the French police would conclude through various intelligence that they believe it was for the People's Liberation Movement in Palestine. That's how they got there. Okay, so let's get into the case, or the timeline of the case. So in October of 2007, Dr. Diab was working at both Carleton and Ottawa U in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. He's originally from Beirut, Lebanon. He'd also lived in Syracuse, New York, where he worked at Syracuse University, and I believe he'd been living and working in Canada since 1993. So in 2007, in October, after he'd finished his class at Ottawa U, a very prominent French reporter came to his class and were like, "Hey, P.S., what do you have to say about the French authorities coming for you for this bombing?" And he was like, "Excuse me? Me?" And they're like, "Yeah, man, like, they've been building a case on you for years, and, like, they're coming for you. Like, what do you have to say about that?" And he was like, "Well, obviously, like, I didn't do it. This is the first time hearing about it. I have no comment." And they're like, "Well, they say they know his name is Hassan Diab, and your name is Hassan Diab, and they know that he was a professor, and you're a professor, so it's, like, it's not looking good for you, buddy." So he was like, WTF, obviously, right? So he tells his wife, and it was said that he was basically followed very closely from that day forward. He knew he was being followed. He was being harassed by lots of reporters. People were calling his house. He always could see in the distance that there was a unmarked cop car that was following him wherever he went. So this is a pretty stressful time for Dr. Diab. On November 13th, 2008, Dr. Diab was arrested. I remember the professor that told me about him getting arrested had said that he was on his way to the airport. Whether he was going on a plane somewhere or he was just going in that direction is not, I don't know. It's very hard to find information about how he was actually arrested if you look up the news, but they had assumed that he was a flight risk, which is why they swooped in and grabbed him, and him being a flight risk would be a recurring theme in all of his legal woes for the next 10 years. Basically. On April 4th, 2009, Dr. Diab was released on bail, $290,000 bail, plus $30,000 a year for his electronic monitoring device, his ankle device, and he was placed under house arrest. He could go to and forth or back and forth to work. His wife, Dr. Rania Tafali, she's also a professor at Carleton University, and he could go anywhere with her as an escort. But he was in detention, I think, for about 4 months in Ottawa in solitary confinement, and they released him on bail to stand trial. On May 29th, 2009, Crown prosecutors would try to get his bail overturned and have him returned to prison. And that part out of the whole case, when I read that, I was like, why? I was like, especially after when I get to the evidence, it'll become more clear. But I was like, why do you guys hate this guy so much? Why? Just let him on bail. He's paid $300,000. He's not a wealthy man. What are you doing, right? On June 26th, that motion was denied. They said, let the man have his bail, and let's just get through this case kind of as quickly as possible. July 29th was a really big moment for the case because Carleton University actually fired Dr. Diab, and this is the most awkward part to talk about, the one that I'm the most nervous about because of the way in which he was fired and all of the politics surrounding that. So B'nai B'rith International is a very powerful, wealthy, well-connected organization that seeks to empower Jewish people all over the world in a variety of different ways. They donate a lot of money to different causes, and they donate a lot of money to Carleton University in particular. So the university, or B'nai B'rith, had made it very clear to Carleton University that they were not happy about Dr. Diab being employed there, especially what he was being accused of, blowing up a synagogue. So they were just like, how dare you even employ this man, considering all the money that we give you, and this is a slap in the face to Jewish people everywhere. Get rid of him. And this is a big problem for a lot of people because there is literally no presumption of innocence. So instantly, 30 of his coworkers all came out and signed an open letter saying that they were pretty much disgusted that the university would fire him. They all spoke to his character. Many, many people that he'd worked with in Syracuse, in California, in Beirut, in Ottawa, all over the place, all came out and said that there was that this case was ridiculous. There was no way that he did it. There was actually a lot of evidence to say that he didn't do it, or it was impossible that it would be done. And so yeah, that was a really bad day for Carleton PR in general. And what's super shady about that part was that he was actually fired by the provost. So the provost, the provost job at a university is to get money from people. That's what they do. They get money, they allocate money, they decide what the projects are. It's the president is sort of the face of the university, and it does all the press conferences and stuff. The provost is we're getting donors and we're building buildings and we're doing stuff. So to get fired by a provost is it's awkward. It's a little sus. So he'd actually only been teaching a little bit of he'd got about 4 classes in, 12 hours worth of teaching before they fired him. So they just paid his entire fee and let him go. As far as I know, I think the Ottawa U continued to employ him at this time, which also made it a little bit awkward. But in 2018, the CBC published an article that said there was a Freedom of Information Act, or Freedom of Information request. I'm not sure what the word is for that, but they made a Freedom of Information request that got all of the emails exchanged between different departments around his termination, and it was very clear from those emails and the correspondence that B'nai B'rith was heavily involved in terminating his contract, which was kind of, yeah, that sucked for him. So this one I actually need to look at my notes because there's like, I have to hold my notes here just because I have to list off some things. So on August 6th, the Canadian Association of Teachers, the National Post, the Canadian Union of Public Employees, the Canadian Labour Congress, 30 members of the Department of Sociology, and the Public Service Alliance of Canada all came out in the same letters, in different letters, and in different statements saying that his termination was not only completely unethical, that there was no presumption of innocence, that it was unconstitutional. They all came out and said that what was happening was really shady, which didn't really have any effect on anything, but it was on public record that a lot of people did not agree with what was happening, and a lot of people began to step up and say that the whole case should be thrown out. Between October 2009 and November 12th, 2014, a whole lot of nothing happened. So by a whole lot of nothing, I mean a lot of things happened that didn't mean anything. So there were like hearings about having hearings, about debating evidence, not like debating like the veracity so much of the evidence, which was, but like how much evidence was there? Is there sufficient evidence to approve a extradition? And later, like I'll talk about the evidence at the end, but then it would later come out that the Canadian government was actually assisting the French prosecution in dragging out the case as long as possible because their case was so weak and it was going to fall apart, and it would be a very embarrassing situation for France-Canada relations. So over that 5 years, there was so much happening in the courts that didn't really mean anything. And one of the most alarming things about those proceedings, there's hundreds of dates that were listed in the timeline, but one of the most disturbing things was that the French lawyer was like, we may or may not have evidence. We might have more evidence. I can't comment at this time on what evidence we have. We have this bit of evidence that I've shown you, but I may or may not have more. I'm not at liberty to discuss. And because it was an extradition hearing, and again, I'll explain in a second why, that was okay. Like imagine if you get arrested by a cop and you're like, officer, what did you arrest me for? And they're like, you know what? We're not at liberty to discuss. It might not even be anything, but we'll find it when we get to the station. So that part was definitely very shady. So on November 13th, 2014, the Canadian government rejected Dr. Diab's leave of appeal. So he had been found not guilty. There was no determination of guilt. They were just assessing whether this case was strong enough to warrant an extradition. And the judge decided that it was worthy of extradition, but so Dr. Diab had said, well, can I have at least, you know what I mean? Can I have a leave? Like, can we defer this a little bit longer for me to build my case here in Canada before I stand trial? That was denied. So the very next day, actually, he was extradited the very following day, which was also really shady because he had 45 days, or they had a 45-day window to extradite him to France to stand or to await trial, but they didn't even wait 24 hours. His wife was 7 months pregnant at the time, and she didn't even get to say goodbye to him. So he went from his hearing where they said he was going to France to the detention center, and then directly right at daybreak was sent on a plane to Paris, where then he stayed in a maximum security prison in Paris in solitary confinement for a period of 3 years and 2 months, minus 10 days in the middle, when like a year and a half in, he got released for about 10 days before, like on bail, the same bail conditions that he'd had before, but that again was overturned by the French prosecution. In total, the entire time that Dr. Diab was in the French prison system or in French custody, he had been ruled to be let go 8 times by 4 different judges. All 4 judges that heard his case over the many iterations would say that it was a crock of shit and that he should be released immediately, that there was really no grounds for a trial, that it was like a very weak case. And also the judge who had sent Dr. Diab to France in the first place also said at his trial, it was not even a trial, his hearing. These words get very confusing. So they had told Dr. Diab in Canada that there was no way that he was guilty of doing this crime based on the evidence. There was actually a lot of evidence pointing away from him, but because of the way extradition works, they had to send him anyway. So he actually sat in that prison for 3 years without any charges being filed against him while the French government built their case against him. So in total, the French government had about 40 years to get information on this guy. Most of their information was even from the 80s, and they were still like really struggling to get their case together. So on January 12th, 2018, after significant public pressure, the French judge, the last one, orders Mr. Diab to be released and sent back to Canada, dismisses the case, says that there's really no reason to keep him in prison, that they've exceeded the time that they can hold him without laying any charges against him, and it's time for him to go home. On May 30th, 2018, Attorney General or Minister of Justice, they're both, Jody Wilson-Raybould, ordered an independent review of the case because it was so, it was wild. So she ordered a review of it. She also had a busy year in 2018 because she was in a lot of trouble with Justin Trudeau for the SNC Lavalin scandal, which is another hot mess, and it's super interesting, but it takes years to talk about that. So she had a rough time that year, but she orders a independent review of the case, which is then headed by Murray Siegel, who is a very famous Canadian legal personality. He's on the board of directors at CAMH, I believe. He also, I'll put up his credentials right here maybe, but he had, he's a big name. So Dr. Diab's camp did not like the fact that he was being asked for the review, and they would later call it a whitewash, which, I can completely understand why they were saying it, but I did end up reading the report. So on July 26, 2019, Murray Siegel completed his report, which is published on the Government of Canada website in its full form, where he goes through the entire case, what all the evidence was, and determines whether or not the Canadian lawyers acted appropriately during the proceedings, which he says, short answer, yes, they did. He highlights all of the problems and all of the controversy surrounding how the case was handled, but says that, we were just doing our job. And that pissed Dr. Diab's camp off a lot for good reason, because he said that, there's a lot of reasons why that wasn't true. For example, when we get to the evidence, the French government was withholding a lot of evidence. The evidence they had was very weak, and it also showed that the Canadian government was assisting the French government to a very large degree because they knew that the case was very weak, it would fall apart, and it was going to be embarrassing. So there was a lot of work trying to make Hassan Diab guilty, even though a lot of people had a very high suspicion that he was completely innocent. On February 7th, 2020, Hassan Diab launches a $90 million lawsuit against the Canadian government for mishandling his extradition case. I believe it's $50 million for his pain and suffering, and then $40 million for his wife and children's pain and suffering, for a total cost price tag of $98 million. His lawyers have said that that's just the number they're throwing out in the ballpark, but they're open to resolving that matter very quickly out of court, and then that won't really be made public knowledge. As far as it's going right now, that case is sort of sitting in limbo while they await the conclusion of his matters in France. On January 27th, 2021, so just a few months ago, the French government, in a very surprising twist, said, yes, you're standing trial. You're going to come back and you're going to do your trial in France. And this kind of really took a lot of people by surprise, because they're like, okay, what's happening? However, Dr. Diab's team are saying that they're very confident that he's not going to have to go back to France, that it'll be handled in a different way than it was before. They can't really bring him back and put him in prison there again. But as of right now, the case is not resolved, and the French government wants to put him on trial just because they want closure for the victims. And also France has this thing about their legal code where they have secret evidence laws, so they're able to talk about information that hasn't been talked about yet, but I don't know why they would have been holding on to this for so long. So they are still doing that, we have more evidence, but we can't talk about it yet. So that will not be made public until the trial begins. On March 3rd, 2021, so quite recently, Justin Trudeau stood up and said that he was going to do everything I can. We're going to do our best to help Dr. Diab. And they're like, that's cute. Like, what are you going to do? And they're like, our best. So we're going to see how that happens and if the Prime Minister is going to get involved in that at all. Okay, so now let's talk about the evidence. We'll just get into that because it's really, like, when you hear the evidence, you're like, okay, there's, yeah, whatever, yeah, right? So when the bombing happened, there was the blue Suzuki which blew up. The police found the debris. They were able to trace that, the purchase of that vehicle to a local dealership, which then listed the bill of sale to a nearby hotel, or the guy was staying at a nearby hotel by the name of Alexander Panadriou. I don't know if I'm saying his name right, but whatever, he killed some people, I don't really care. And as it turns out, the name is a fake name anyway. So they had traced his residence to a hotel where they got his eyewitness statements of what he looked like, who he was, and also his hotel registration card, which they tested for fingerprints initially, and their police department said that there was no fingerprints on it. However, right after they did their own police department tested for fingerprints, they had a private firm test for fingerprints, and they found a lot of fingerprints on it, none of which were a match for Dr. Diab. And the French authorities knew that when they were pursuing him, but they didn't tell the Canadian government or Dr. Diab until he was already extradited many, many years later. So they had that. They also had traced Alexander Panadriou to a arrest that was made 3 days before, I believe, or it was like maybe a week before, where he had stolen a pair of pliers. So, and he was interviewed by police. He'd filled out a police report. They tested that for fingerprints. Again, originally they said that there were no usable fingerprints on it. However, there were fingerprints on it. And again, those were not a match. A car connected to the plot was found nearby the explosion that had palm prints inside the car. Those were also not a match for Dr. Diab. Eyewitness statements would say that the man was probably in his 40s with gray hair, and Dr. Diab was 26 at the time that this happened. So again, that's not really lining up. Originally, the cops had assumed that the attack was carried out by a neo-Nazi group. There was a lot of really terroristy things happening all over Europe at that time. So different groups were taking ownership of responsibility for that. But the police investigation concluded that it was done by a Liberation for Palestine group, which they got through German intelligence, through an unnamed source. But again, a lot of the French prosecution and their evidence was relying on secret intelligence, which they're not required to disclose how they got that information. In addition to this, another man was arrested in Rome in 1981 with a fake passport that was using the name Hassan Diab, and it was a guy that was born in 1953 in Beirut, so it was like the same birth date, same name as Hassan Diab. And I'm not really sure what happened to that guy who was using that passport. I think they let him go, or I didn't really follow what happened there. But that's the name Hassan Diab, the passport, and some intelligence that they were getting from German spies were saying that it all led to Dr. Diab in Ottawa. So that is basically all of the evidence that they have. So over the the extradition hearings that they were having in Canada, they were presenting that this is the evidence they had, but the Canadian court was not required to rule on any of that evidence. And in the time that Dr. Diab was in France, they were not able to get any more or any stronger evidence to push the case to a trial or lay any formal charges. 2 handwriting experts from the police force, the French police force, testified that writing samples collected from Dr. Diab matched the hotel registration form, the police report, and some other things. However, it was determined that the writing sample that they were using to compare, that the writing experts were using to compare the registration card and Dr. Diab's writing for Alexander Panadriou, they weren't actually even using Dr. Diab's writing. His ex-wife, his first wife, her writing sample had gotten mixed in with his file. So that was really awkward for the French. So they withdrew those writing analysis, and they got a third analyst to come out and say the same thing, that they'd retaken writing samples from him at a different time, and then she also alleged that it was a match. Every other writing analyst that's ever looked at it from all over the world, multiple top handwriting analysis experts have looked at The handwriting, I believe Dr. Diab's team even had 125 witnesses that came forward and said that there's no validity or no basis in reality for any of these allegations. And the French were like, nope, sorry, like, we're sticking with our guns. That he was the guy that did this. So yeah, so that is basically all of the evidence they have. So lastly, I'll talk about Murray Siegel's review, which Dr. Diab's camp, like, they're boycotting it, but I did find it very informative, and it did raise some very salient points about extradition proceedings in Canada. So I found it very informative, but I can also understand why they think it's a crock of BS. Because Murray Siegel's review would exonerate the Canadian government from any wrongdoing and said they were just doing their jobs. So to explain how that happened. So in 1999, the Canadian government updated their Extradition Act, and it's more like a treaty because so it was like a lot of participating countries are involved in this, and it was even more like intimate between Canada and France because we have like the French connection. So the idea of the Extradition Act is that you only need to accomplish three tasks to extradite somebody to another country. One, is this the person that you're looking for? Is this Mike Hunt? We are looking for Mike Hunt. Is this him? Yes, this is Mike Hunt. Check. Number two, is there evidence? Not like how good is the evidence or like what is the evidence, but like, is there evidence? Yes, we have these handwriting analysis for Mike Hunt. So that's all we need. Let us handle it. And then number three, are you going to sentence the accused to a punishment or sentence that we would not do in Canada or would exceed the maximum penalties that we have in Canada? So basically, are you going to kill them? Are you going to sentence them to death? No? Check. And then Canada washes her hands of the whole thing. So in that regard, Murray Siegel's review would say that they were basically just doing their job because even though the Canadian government knew that there was no evidence or no viable, reliable, there's no reliable evidence, they still had evidence, and this was the person they were looking for. So in a mutually beneficial agreement, their hands were tied. They couldn't really say no to France to giving them Mr. Diab, Dr. Diab, because they had fulfilled the very basic requirements of extradition. So the judge that actually there's like a quote from the judge who initially extradited Mr. Diab, and he said that if this case was tried in Canada, it would be thrown out in 2 seconds, that it wouldn't even go to trial in Canada because the evidence was so weak. So yeah, that is the awful saga of Dr. Diab's extradition nightmare with France. He'd spent 3 years and 2 months in solitary confinement without any charges laid against him. He was on bail for 5 years in Canada with an electronic monitoring device that he had to pay for himself, and now he's suing the government for $90 million. So that's what we have to think about. Is he an unfortunate sort of casualty in our extradition agreements with other countries? Because these agreements are set up in such a way that if a crime is committed in a certain country, that Canada will be very agreeable to extraditing that person to stand trial in whatever country, and we expect the same in return. That if someone had committed a crime in Canada, that the participating countries would return that person to us to face our justice system, and it's supposed to work out. So do we need extradition reform, or you know what I mean? Is this just an unfortunate casualty? So yeah, so that's everything. If you like this and you want to hear more, or you want to fact check me, please like, comment, and subscribe, and be good to each other. Okay, bye.